Do you want to record? Hello, hello. Okay, so my friends. Oh, hey. Oh, Julie, what's up? Danira, Kathy, Barbara, Sonia, what's up, everyone? Hello, good morning. Welcome to Wake the Fuck Up Wednesday. And I don't know about y'all, but I kind of just need to take a deep breath right now because Mercury in retrograde has been going on a hella long time. And can I just say, I'm kind of over it. It's like supposed to be done October 18th, but literally every day I wake up, it's like, oh, someone said something to me and they made a mistake and it's not how we thought and we have to like revisit everything. Or it's like, oh, the podcast title was misunderstood, like literally every day. And I'm like, is that a thought? Is Mercury retrograde a thought? It may be that Mercury is in retrograde, but what we all know is that how we are responding to it can make a big difference, right? So anyway, I'm trying to be fucking zen because really I want to be like fucking hell. Like in Ted Lasso, the guy who like swears a ton, I can totally relate to him because my daughter is always like, Mom, you said a bad word. And I'm like, oh, I know, sorry. But anyway, I am ready to drop in with you today to talk about boundaries, to talk about how to create healthy boundaries, okay? Because it is one of the ways that we can create more empowerment in our lives. We teach people how to treat us, and boundaries is one of those ways, whether we create them in the first place, and if we do create them, do we enforce them, right? Because I know that so many people want to say yes, right? Like we are yes people. I'm a yes person, right? Like if my husband's like, hey, I want to go do this expedition, I'm like, I really want to say yes, right? I'm not the type to be like, oh, no. So for those of us that are yes people, boundaries becomes even more important, right? So today we're going to talk about how to do that in a healthy way. We're going to talk about what is the difference between a boundary versus an ultimatum. And we're really going to talk about where the source of the boundary comes from, because there's a big misunderstanding about boundaries. Like, I think sometimes when people have an experience of not setting boundaries, they then go to the other extreme and they're like, what the fuck? This is how it's going to go and better deal with it, right? And so there's, as with all things, a middle way. So let's talk about that. So the other day I was talking to one of my clients who was like, oh, I really love your relationship and how it seems, like how you both go out and get it and you seize the day and you're both living these really adventurous lives and you enjoy your relationship. And I was like, oh, wait, let's rein that back in because it's not as glamorous as it seems. Yes, freedom is both of our, one of our primary values. And so we decided early on that our relationship wouldn't look like many others. Like we're not the type that's like, oh, I need to be around you all the time and yada, yada. Like, it's like we are with each other to help each other live our life to the fullest, right? Now, within that though, is then like, you're still two human beings. And then we added a child, which made it three. And some things impact one another. And we had to decide like, what is just a preference versus something that needs to be a boundary, right? Because what ended up happening was because I'm a yes person, in the first like year or actually 3 years of Maya's life, my partner was gone a lot. Like I remember one year it was like 3.5 months, and that didn't even include weekends or evenings, which he also went and did paragliding. And people are like, oh, but it's his work. I'm like, no, he like literally left the state to go paragliding for 3.5 months total that year, plus weekends and evenings. And I was like, why am I like so bitter right now? Why am I so resentful? And I was thinking about it and I was like, oh, like I'm doing this alone a lot of the time. And that's not what I signed up for. That's not what we had agreed on. And so I had to kind of think like, how do I express this? Right. So I just said, hey, look, like I need you to be around more. Okay. Like I really need help here. I am like sleep deprived. I am like literally my mind is like going away from me. I can't think clearly anymore. Like, I was getting sick a lot because I wasn't sleeping. I was just like, I need help. Like, this is too much for me to do by myself. And he was like, okay. And then it never happened. And I was so pissed. I was like, dude, I'm not even expecting you to read my mind. What's going on here? Right. And he was like, oh, what? I am around more. But there was no way to quantify it because I never clarified it. So one of the things about creating healthy boundaries is making sure that whatever request you make or boundary you set, that the parameters are really clear so that it's known like if it's being violated or not, right? So being around a lot or more seemed obvious to me, but obviously it's not to him. So I had to like really quantify it. And so, oh, and just as an aside, the other thing about having a lot of freedom in your relationship is you have to have such good communication frequently. And one of our therapists was like, the reason you argue so much, y'all, is because every day you have to have conversations, which are all potential areas for conflict, about things that most couples don't have to talk about every day. Like it's kind of a given who does what on any given day. They have a routine, but because we prioritize freedom, there's no routine or very little routine, right? We pretty much give as much routine as we can to our kid. But, you know, when it came to us, there wasn't that. And so those were all potential areas for conflict where we could have an argument or some tension, right? So with any relationship, these healthy boundaries are so important. Now, so one is getting really clear, right, about how you ask for it. The other concept I want to remind you of, which I talked about in episode 16 of the podcast, is the manual. So we all have this kind of manual of expectations, right? And we may not think we have one. We're like, oh no, I let you do you. And you're my bestie. And I just accept you for who you are. Well, guess what? Usually we do that initially because we feel that they're following our manual and we don't realize we have a manual for them until they don't. Like, oh, say for example, COVID mitigation issues. I'm just saying, so many people have conflict right now in friendships, relationships, in their community, because they're like, I love you, I love you, I love you. And they're like, wait, you don't want to wear a mask? Or wait, you want me to wear a mask inside? Or wait, like, and then it's like all of a sudden we realize, oh, I didn't realize I had this manual where I put you in this category that was like, I need you to do this and show up like this. And the manual is often there to protect us from feeling uncomfortable. So we kind of have this way that we expect people we know that are in our lives to behave in order for us to avoid feeling uncomfortable. And that's where it becomes not okay, because on both ends. One is we don't want to try to control someone else. First of all, we can't. We may think we can, but ultimately we can't. An adult can do whatever the fuck they want, right? So one is we think we want to control someone, but yet we don't want to be controlled, right? So that's one element of it. The other element is that we give up our power when we let our emotional well-being lie in someone else's behavior, which is often what that manual does, right? And often the boundaries we want to create are really around things that we need to really take ownership of, right? Like, oh, you need to pick up your socks off the floor. This is like annoying, like it's a house, I have to do all this stuff. And it's like, that's a boundary we want to create, right? But it's because we don't like how we feel when we look at it, right? oh, that makes me feel annoyed that the house is messy. Or if someone is like, someone just tells the same jokes over and over and over, and you're like, that's really annoying. I need you just to stop telling those stories again over and over, right? Those aren't what boundaries are for, right? We have this manual of how we want people to behave so that we feel more comfortable, so that we can have a higher chance of being happy. Yet we need to take emotional maturity to that next level and own that we can choose to not listen. We can choose to pick it up ourselves. We can choose to hire a cleaning person if you have that capacity, right? We could choose to not make it bother, like let it bother us, right? So there's so many ways that we can accept responsibility for our emotional response. Now, what are boundaries for? Healthy boundaries are for when someone is violating your physical space or safety, or your emotional, mental space and energy. Now, emotional space. This does not mean that if they make you sad or angry, that requires a boundary. What I mean is when it's actually abusive or toxic, right? Or really violating that like limited amount of energy you have. Okay. For example, physical. So a boundary is appropriate if someone's like, hey, if someone is, let's go extreme, if someone hits you, it's like, I will call the police, right? If someone is yelling at you and emotionally abusing you, it's like, when that happens, I'm going to step out of the room, right? It is, if someone is coming over all the time and invading your physical space, knocking without like being unannounced and kind of invading the space that you have, it's like, hey, well, I'm going to ignore. If you don't like talk to me in advance about it, I'm going to ignore it even if I'm home. Like you could be like, I know you're in there. Yep, I am. Bye. Right? So boundaries are about physical space and safety, emotional and mental space and safety, not to make you happy. Okay. Okay. So that's a really important element. Another important element of a healthy boundary is that, just like I was mentioning, we can't control other people, even though we really want to. I've tried. Just it doesn't work, right? So when we create a healthy boundary, it's about what we are going to do. It's actually not about like, you better stop that. It's actually not about trying to change the other person's behavior. It is what you are going to do. So if you notice in the examples I gave, if someone's always coming over unannounced, it's not like, you better stop doing that, or you can't ever come to my house ever again, right? That's not a boundary. That's like an ultimatum and a threat, right? A boundary is, oh, if you come by unannounced, I am not going to open the door or come to the door or talk to you, right? I love you, but if you do that, that's what's going to happen. If you have someone who is like I was saying, verbally abusive or physically abusive, it's about what you're going to do, right? Now, this is not about putting up with abuse. I just want to make that super clear. This isn't about like, oh, well, if someone's hitting me, this is about what I'm gonna do, and it's my fault. No, 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 no. Like, this is about we can't change that person's behavior. We like to think we can. So what are we gonna do? Right? What are we gonna do in order to protect our own physical space and safety and our emotional and mental health space and safety? So if you always call a parent and they are verbally abusive to you, and you've tried to make requests and they're not doing it, right? We'll talk about the difference between requests and boundaries in a minute. Then you can say, okay, if you start shaming me, if you use the word should and start criticizing me on a phone call, I'm going to remind you of this boundary and I love you, but I'm going to hang up, right? That's something you are doing. You're not like, you better stop doing that. It's like, if you do that, this is what I'm going to do. And they get to choose. They get to choose. Okay. Okay. So request versus boundary. When we are making boundaries, it does not mean that we can't make requests. Like we can say, hey, could you work on picking up your socks off the floor? Or hey, could you work on like maybe not telling that same story over and over? Or hey, can you work on like whatever your version of not being so obnoxious is? But our emotional happiness is not dependent on that. We can manage our minds to deal with that. And we can also respect their autonomy as an adult, their free will, right? So another thing about boundaries that's really important, and there's so much on this topic, please go listen to the podcast that's going to drop tomorrow. But another important thing about our boundaries is we need to enforce them. So we teach people how to treat us, right? And if we are not enforcing our boundaries, whether someone's like evil or not, like they sense that. I mean, we're just humans. Remember, motivational tribe, we're going to do what's easy. So if our brain picks up on like, they're not going to enforce this boundary, like that person doesn't even have to be an asshole. They're just like doing what the brain does, which is knowing you're not going to enforce the boundary. So the easier thing is to probably, just keep on going with life as it was. So if you look at kids, right, with their parents, I see this all the time at parties. Like people be having a great time. The kid will do something annoying. And then the parent will be like, stop that or we're going to go home. Does the parent want to go home? Mm-mm. So when the kid knows this. So then the kid does it again. And the person, I said, stop that or we're going to go home. It's like, then the kid's like, what the fuck? This like, isn't serious. Right. And so we need to choose the way that we're going to enforce our boundary in a way that we know we can follow through on. Okay. I go into this, there's a boundariestraining.com. If you go to boundariestraining.com, not boundary, boundariestraining.com, you can download this like in detail. There's a workbook and everything. It's free. So check that out. But it is so important to enforce this because, and you want to pick something that relates to what's going on. It's not like you better stop doing that or you don't get any cookies or like you better stop doing that or I'm not going to cook dinner for you unless it's related somehow to dinner. But like you want it to be really like, hey, if you're yelling at me, I'm going to protect my space by leaving the room. And so it directly relates to you being able to protect, right? So we look at all of these different examples. Let's say like with a COVID example, let's take a COVID example. So you have two friends, one is way into mask wearing indoors, the other one's not, and yet they love each other. So please don't let this divide your love for your friends. Okay, but let's say that's happening. And one friend wants to come over, the one who's like not interested in wearing masks indoors. Well, instead of like giving all these threats or something, you can say, hey, if you want to hang out indoors and you can't wear a mask or you don't want to wear a mask, then I'll have to decline. Or we can go do something outside, right? That's a boundary. You're protecting your physical health. I'm assuming that the person, once the person wear a mask, is protecting their physical safety, right? And they're like, okay, so this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to decline and I'm going to offer some things to do outside, right? So it's about what we're going to do. And it's directly related to that boundary violation when we enforce it. So really think about that. I have definitely been in situations in relationship where I needed to leave, right? It was like either I was not physically safe or I was not emotionally safe. It was toxic for the mental health, right? So then the boundary is like, if this continues, this is what I'm going to do. And some people are like, how is that not an ultimatum? And, I'm sure there's lots of different ways we can get into this with linguistics or semantics, but here's how I see it. I take it from a emotional perspective. Here's an ultimatum. You better fucking stop doing that or I'm fucking out of here. You don't get to be my partner anymore. A boundary is, I love you and I really want this to work, but I have to love me too. So if this continues, if that ever happens again, I'll have to leave. Right? Do you feel the difference? You're not trying to control the other person's behavior. You're simply owning what you need to do to protect your physical or mental, emotional space and safety and health, right? So that's how we can kind of approach it. It's sort of enforcing boundaries like a Buddha is not from a controlling, angry place. It actually comes from love. It comes from compassion and understanding, right? It comes from loving that person unconditionally does not mean that you have to be around them if they're violating your boundaries. You can still love them and say, hey, and this is how I'm going to protect myself. It really comes from a place of calm and centeredness, okay? So when you might be confused about like, well, am I approaching this from like a boundary versus ultimatum? You can choose to not tell someone about your boundary. Sometimes people ask, do I have to tell people about my boundary? And I'm like, not necessarily. Sometimes it's helpful because then they know it's there and they might be more mindful and not violate, but you can also just have a boundary without having the discussion. Like, hey, if that's what people do, this is what I'm going to do, right? You don't have to discuss it. So, like in some relationships where I think of like, gosh, I wish I created a boundary about that and left sooner. It would have been so nice if I had just had the ability in hindsight to like just quietly reflect, like, this is my decision. And if this happens again, this is what I'm going to do. Right. And so that can be a good experiment, right? I've done it since. It's like, okay, this is my boundary. That person can do them. And I don't really want to get into it or explain it or any of that. I'm just going to enforce it from within. Okay. And if you aren't voicing it, then you're not serving it as an ultimatum because you're not threatening anything, right? You're just quietly deciding within what is your boundary. Okay. So there's so much more, like I said, there's so much more about this in the pod. So I would love for you to go listen to it. And I would love for you to download boundariestraining.com. Go to boundariestraining.com. That's a free boundaries training where I go into this. I walk you through some activities. There's a workbook. I think it'll be super helpful. Okay. All right. I got to go because I got the next thing to do and deal with more of this Mercury retrograde stuff. Okay. All right. Come join Freedom School, y'all. The October registration, or I'm sorry, November registration is open and you'll still get access to the October materials. So come to joinfreedomschool.com. I'd love to see you in there. We dive into this. We have calls every week. It'll be awesome. And trust me, when it comes to enforcing boundaries, we often need that extra support. Okay. All right. I love you so much. Have an amazing rest of your week. Bye.